Let me also say good morning to all of you men and women, and also all you little guys. About 6 years ago, I left this area and moved to Chagrin Falls, where I lived at Hamlet Village. But before that, I lived here, as Rick has said, for many, many years. And I'm really pleased to be back here to see so many of you, my old friends, in this wonderful, wonderful city. I want to thank Rick for making all this possible for me. I don't have any notes because some of you know I'm blind in one eye and I don't see well out of the other eye. But the Lord's been good to me in many other ways, so I don't have much to grumble about. On Memorial Day, you're supposed to remember some things, and I very vividly remember some things that occurred in the Asian Pacific field time frame, probably 8 months before the war ended. We were the Marines and the soldiers were fighting the Japanese for many, many months in the small islands. And, excuse me, and in this time frame, we were beginning to win regularly, small battles and big battles. But strangely enough, in spite of winning big battles, we didn't have any prisoners. And it was kind of a mystery. And it turns out that the Japanese, with their feeling of honor, did not want to give up to be prisoners. So they had a ceremony where they'd line up and they'd hold a hand grenade to their stomachs, and at the sign of a signal they'd pull the pins and 100 people would die, or 200 or 300. There were many hundreds who committed suicide that way. And our military leaders said, hey, if we're ever going to win this war, we're going to have to do something different. And they were thinking then, we'll move in with bombers and we'll obliterate everything that supports the Japanese army, and then they'll have to give up. So they thought that at that time it would be appropriate to have probably 2 bombing runs a day into Japan. One was going to be a pre-dawn, low-level flight under radar, and the other would be a high-level night flight. A high-level flight would probably be 25,000, 30,000 feet, which was above the anti-aircraft reach, and also they would see the lighted facilities at night. It would make it easier for them to pinpoint where they dropped their bomb. To do that, they were going to need a lot of fighter cover, which they didn't have. So it was decided they would form 3 new fighter squadrons. One would train over the Atlantic Ocean, another over the Pacific, and another in the Philippines. I was chosen to be one who was with the squadron over the Atlantic Ocean. A colonel led that squadron. There were 4 flights. Each flight had 4 planes, 16 planes altogether. And it was a pretty intensive training. We'd get together every morning at about 7:30 at the flight line. We'd taxi out to the airstrip, line up in close formation, take off in close formation to about 2,000 feet, wait to rendezvous with the rest of the flight, fly out over the ocean. We get about several miles out off beyond the shoreline. We drop down to 30 feet, and we'd spend the next 6 hours, not 30 feet, 300 feet. We'd spend the next 6 hours at 300 feet or lower. Starting the first day, we'd probably drop down every hour for 5 or 10 minutes to 50 feet. And each succeeding day, we'd spend more and more time at the 50-foot level. And ultimately, at the end of about the 2nd month, we would be flying the full 60 hours, 6 hours at 50 feet. Now, why 50 feet? Well, in those days, the radar in Japan could pick us up if we were higher than about 60 feet. So if we're going to have a morning flight coming in over the east coast of Japan under radar, we'd want to safely stay at about 50 feet. And that went on day after day after day. Now, most of you know that the Atlantic Ocean is not a good place to water ski. It's pretty choppy. We've got typically waves 10, 20 feet, and that was no problem. But occasionally, in the Atlantic Ocean, we'll see waves of 45 feet. And the spray from those waves will come up to 60 feet. And the kinetic energy in those sprays is fantastic. If it hits the airplane, it'll flip it around like a paper plate in a hurricane. There's not much you can do about it. And we normally flew at about 240 miles an hour because that was a good fuel conserving speed. At 240 miles an hour, that's about 350 feet per second. It's about the length of a football field every second. And we were only at 50 feet, so you didn't have a hell of a lot of time to recover from any kind of significant disturbance. In a fraction of a second at 50 feet, you'd be in the ocean. When you hit the ocean, it's like hitting a concrete wall. The pilot immediately was crushed to death. There was no recovery of any kind, no time to do anything. So we would look at the colonel who was leading the flight. I always flew his left wing. We would be charged with looking ahead as much as we could to try to find these high waves if there were some. They weren't frequent, and veer off so we wouldn't get caught by it. But the first thing we would do is veer off, and the second thing is open up the formation so there's a little space between the planes, giving us a few moments to try to recover if we did hit this turbulence with pilots. I must say, hate to say, but during the first half of our training, we lost 6 or 8 people, pilots who got caught in this kind of thing and went into the ocean. It was not a frequent thing, but it was a dangerous kind of thing. As time went on, we got to be a little better at it, and we went on for about 5 months doing the same kind of routine every morning. Get together at 7:30 and go through the routine I just described. By the end of the second month, we were at 50 feet all the time. Excuse me. And that was kind of the end of it. I failed to mention why it was P-47, so I'll take a moment to mention that. The P-47 was clearly the best plane in the world for low-level work. From ground level to about 5,000 feet, there wasn't a better plane in the world. We could take a hell of a beating, and we could give a hell of a beating. And similarly for high level, above 20,000 feet, we were quite good. We also had a P-51 Mustang, which I thought was better than my plane. It had a better rate of climb. It had more maneuverability, but it couldn't sustain flight as long as we could. I could be in my plane for 9.5 hours. You get back to the base and still have some significant amount of fuel left. So we had the advantage of, after a bomb run, we would have time to turn around and probably get back to an uninhabited island and save the airplane, save the pilot, to be ready to go back another time. They also talked about putting an aircraft carrier out in the bay where we could land on the aircraft carrier. P-47s weren't meant to do that, but each day we would practice. When we came home from our run over the ocean, we would practice landing on a very short landing. The leader would go ahead of us, we'd be one after another in a straight line, and he'd come in, chop his throttle at the end of the runway. Excuse me just a moment. And then he would come in dead stick. The first thing he did was make a barrel roll as he flew down over the runway, and then turn left across wind and upwind and back around and come in and land and try to land in the first 50 feet of the runway. We were required to land in the first 100 feet of the runway. If we didn't make it, we'd have to go out Sundays and keep shooting landings until we could land at least 3 times in a row within the first 100 feet of the runway. We were encouraged and tried, and I was quite successful at landing every day within the first 50 feet. If you did that, you'd be able to get on the carrier and stop before you came off the other end of the carrier. So that went on for a kind of training for roughly 5 months. At the end of that time, they shipped me off to California, where I was to wait for a military air transport to take me on to Manila. And that same day, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And I was and we were all sent back to our base to wait for further orders. And I was kind of unhappy about the fact that I'd spent all that time, all that work, all that training, and now I wasn't going to be able to use it in any way at all. As a matter of fact, I was kind of pissed off for years thereafter. And then about 4 years ago, my younger son and I took a trip around the world, and we spent 3 days in Hiroshima. I spent a lot of time in their museums. They had sections that showed what it was like the instant the bomb was dropped and what would happen. For example, the heat was so intense that human beings or horses or animals of any kind, there was nothing left. There was no skull, no bones. There was nothing but fine ash. The heat was just so intense. They had other sections that showed what it was like a half a mile away or a mile away. And amazingly, they had people there, a few people my age, who had lived through it. Several of them had had some radiation damage. Their faces were distorted, and their shoulders were distorted. But they were there to talk with us. And amazingly, there was no animosity. There was no challenge. They were there just to tell us the facts. They weren't angry at the United States. They weren't angry with me. They talked just as you and I could talk today. I thought it was absolutely amazing that people could do that. They could tell us what it was like. The misery, the pain, the suffering. People lived for 2 hours. Other people lived for 2 days or 2 months. It was just an amazing experience. My son and I then used bicycles, and we rode around that whole area for several days to look at the remnants of things that were left that showed how intense had been the devastation. I remember particularly one building. It had been a high-rise apartment, probably 14, 15 stories high. And there was a big I-beam, 10, 12-inch I-beam was hanging down with one of the structural members that had been so heated it hung there like a wet noodle. It had been distorted significantly. And at the end of 3 days, I stood where the bomb had dropped, and suddenly I felt very different about my concern about not having used the skills and experience that had been developed during that training. I was glad I had not been one who brought that devastation to those people. When I was 18 years old, I volunteered for the service. I don't think anybody volunteered to be recognized. They volunteered because they thought it was the right thing to do. When I was 20 years old, I had no compunction at all about doing what I was paid to do, to kill the enemy. No compunction at all. But here now, when I stood in Hiroshima at age 90 plus, I felt very different about it, and I feel different about it today. You know, our country is the most powerful nation in the world, militarily. Power is great, but power is also dangerous. You know, we hear of bullies in school, bullying little kids, taking advantage of them. They're not using power sensibly. We remembered the story of Hitler and what he did. He had immense power. He killed people. He stole from people. He made slaves of people. Obviously, he did not use power sensibly. And each day as I look at the paper, watch television, I'm kind of embarrassed that I don't think our government is always using power sensibly. I feel strongly about that. So my message today to you people is try to be compassionate. Try to be understanding, patient. Show some love to your fellow man. Don't overuse your power. probably everyone here today has at one time or another, in some way, used power inappropriately. Try not to do that. The more we have of compassion and understanding, the better will be your lives and the lives of all the people around you. So that's kind of my message to you today. I no longer feel the way I did when I was 20 years old. So let me just leave by saying, I'll ask the Lord to watch over you and bless you with good health, happiness, good fortune, and ask the Lord to help us rid this world of hatred, greed, and violence, and make us ever conscious of the need to show compassion and love and caring and understanding to fellow man. So with that, I'll say goodbye. God bless you. I hope you continue to enjoy today. I salute you all.